Hello, everyone. Welcome to Scary Stories to Haunt Your Dreams with me, your host, Screams and Dreams. I hope you all enjoy these spooktastic stories I have lined up for you in this video. And remember, sleep tight. You're going to notice a woman in your home. You must ignore her. It was December of 1999 when she invested our quiet Midwestern home. My father called for me from downstairs. I assumed it was time for dinner. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs and had his hand up in an effort to keep me from coming down. The moment I saw the panic in his eyes, I knew something was wrong. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," he said. My heart started to race as he continued. "It's very important that you keep your eyes on me. You're going to notice something else in our home, but you must ignore her as much as possible." I almost started laughing, my 12-year-old mind trying to comprehend what he was getting at, assuming this was some sort of out-of-character joke. Before I could respond, he continued, "She's going to whisper things, follow you, and whatever else she can to get your attention. It's going to be very difficult, son, but you must never interact with her. I promise she will leave, but only if you pretend she isn't there and try not to think about her. Promise me." There were so many things I wanted to ask him, but I was too frightened and confused. I managed to spit out, "Okay, Dad." "All right, come downstairs. It's time for dinner. Hurry." I've made her stronger just by telling you. But I had to. I can't afford you looking at her by mistake. Trust me. Now stay focused, he barked. I did as I was told and slowly crept down the stairs, keeping my eyes glued to my father's as he backpedaled into the kitchen. I felt the temperature drop significantly as I reached the first floor. I smelled a familiar, sickening, and sour scent in the air. It reminded me of the time a raccoon died in our wall and stunk up the house for a whole week. My father and I sat down at the table at the same time. My sister was across from me. Her head hung and her eyes stared at the empty porcelain plate in front of her. My mother pulled a casserole out of the oven. Her eyes were swollen and tear-stained. I kept my focus on my family, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see a blurry mess of dark, matted hair and sickly gray skin. There was no energy in the kitchen, drained of all the warmth and laughter that usually accompanied our meals. My sister grabbed my knee under the table and whispered, "Can you see her too?" I nodded. "Quiet," my father hissed. The woman walked forward with wet, crackling footsteps. The smell was nauseating. She crept toward the table, stopping directly behind my sister, only a few inches away, and rested a decrepit hand on her shoulder. She winced in fear and stared at me. I immediately put my head down. My mother served our dinner, doing her best to pretend as if everything was okay. I could see my father clutching my sister's hand underneath the glass table in an attempt to keep her from completely losing it. My sister spent the entire dinner with the skeletal hand on her shoulder. Nearly inaudible whispers spewed from the woman's mouth and filled the room like white noise. And that's how we lived for months, doing our best to live a normal life despite the ever-present unwanted guest. Even if we left the house, she was somehow able to follow us all. Whenever the four of us were in the car, she could be seen in the rearview mirror or standing on the side of the road. My parents didn't let anyone visit and never let us stay at friends' homes during the months of hell. We were able to whisper to one another when it was absolutely necessary to discuss her presence, if she wasn't too close. My father made us promise to never tell anyone. That was the only way to quarantine her, the parasite of attention. We concluded that she infected a single household at a time, unable to be seen by anyone outside the home unless their mind had been tainted with knowledge of her existence. I learned a few years later that my father was the reason for her arrival. His sister, back in the 70s, had been infected from another, and it followed my aunt into their home. In 1999, for whatever reason, my father struggled to keep the thought of her at bay. In turn, he brought her back into his life, and ours. We kept the promise of keeping her a secret from others, and it was the hardest thing we've ever done. All of us tried leaving the house as a group, and she followed. We couldn't bring ourselves to break our family apart. It was hardest for my mother, who was stuck alone with her while we were at school and my father was at work. Everything changed the day my mother broke. It was a snowy February night. We had finished dinner and my mother decided to go to bed early. She was sitting on their bed, making herself impossible to ignore. My mother couldn't take it. I heard her screaming from the bedroom, demanding that she leave us alone. My father sprinted upstairs to try and stop her. That was the last I ever saw my mother. A pool of blood on the white carpet was all that remained. The woman was still there, but my mother was gone. In the following weeks, she whispered to me. She told me I could see my mother again. All I had to do was look and ask how. I never did. The reason I am telling you is because I want you to think about her. I saw her again this morning for the first time in 18 years. I cannot afford to lose my wife or children to the parasite. I need you to think about her dark hair and gray skin. Think about her in your home so that she may leave mine. You're already infected, and eventually you're going to notice a woman in your home. You must ignore her. It's for your own good. I'm so sorry. We got lost in a forest, and it was one of the strangest experiences of my life. The following is a story that took place quite a few years back now. However, it still baffles me completely, and I'd like to share it here. I'm a teenager, and I've been scouting/Boy Scouts for nearly all my life, and I really enjoy exploring with my friends and being trusted more as I'm older now. A few years ago, me and two girls named Amy and Harriet were asked to head into the woods surrounding our campsite to find a long, straight stick suitable for carving into a point. Bear in mind that I was a lot younger back then. Harriet was older, and Amy only 1 year older than myself. We had been walking in deliberately the same direction as to not get lost, and memorizing the surroundings as we went, in order to find our way back easily. About 15 minutes in, we couldn't find anything to take back, so we turned around to return to the campsite. That's when the initial panic set in. The trees had almost unnaturally knitted themselves together in such a way that it seemed our path was non-existent in the first place. like it had just vanished. We looked around 360 degrees, and now everything looked exactly the same. Trees we could have sworn were different from one another appeared as all copies of the same tree. We kept walking in what we thought to be the correct direction, while shouting out for help, and eventually came to a concrete path, almost like a road, but very thin, separating the forest, splitting it into two. We didn't follow the road as it went in the wrong direction to our campsite. On the other side of the path was more forest. However, nearby was an abandoned shack, likely used for storage or whatever else. We had no idea anything like this was out here in these woods, so we just kept walking. We eventually came to a road we didn't recognize. A woman wearing a pink and purple regatta outdoors coat walked past, and we frantically asked her for the direction of our campsite, as by now, according to our watches and Harriet's phone, we'd been walking for an hour and a half. She'd said she'd never seen us before, but she said there's another campsite in that direction. We followed her advice and eventually came back to our campsite. We frantically apologized for being so long and that we couldn't find anything. The leader, Ian, could see all three of us were shaken up, and he stated he was confused that we'd only been gone 25 minutes and that our free time was still going on. To this day, this baffles all three of us, as our free time was 40 minutes long, and our watches and phones had said we'd been gone for hours. The forest we were lost in felt crushing and claustrophobic, like we'd entered an area that the concept of time didn't apply to. I believe in the paranormal. However, this was so unlike anything I've heard or experienced before. It literally was like we'd been in a time vortex or something, and that hours in the forest were only minutes in the rest of the world. The feeling was very strange, and it stuck with me for the rest of camp. Not my mother. So this story happened about 11 years ago. I was a senior in high school at the time, but it is the single most mind-boggling thing that I have ever experienced. It's also important to note that it happened in mid-December. I am from Iowa, and the winters here get cold at night. Like, if you get stuck outside, you will die kind of cold. That plus the snowfall makes everything dead silent. You can hear anything and everything inside the house and even immediately outside of it. Well, me and my best friend were hanging out in my family's walkout basement, just having a boring winter night playing video games. We were also the only ones home. The reason it was just us is because my mother went from work straight to a bar to grab a few drinks with coworkers. So me and my friend thought it would be a good idea to break into the family wine and live a little. As we were sitting there opening up the first bottle, I hear the door to the garage open and slam shut. I immediately go, "Oh shit," and start looking for places to hide the bottle. My friend then says, "I thought you said your mom was supposed to be out all night." "She was," I replied. I then heard a few heavy stomps and hear my mother yell out, "Meowsin' Boo! Anyone home?" I yell back up the stairs, "Yup, just hanging out in the basement." I hear a few more steps move from the garage door toward the stairs, and she yells out again, "Can you come help me with something? I need you up here." I reply back while frantically trying to find a good place to hide the wine bottle. "Yup, just give me a minute." Then there was silence for about 20 seconds. "Anyone down there with you?" she yelled back in a more slightly concerned, serious tone, in a voice that was slightly off of my mother's. This was the first thing that told me something wasn't right. Our family never cared if anyone was over, as our house was a very open house to all family and friends, and the voice, it was just wrong. Like it sounded like my mother's, but it was missing something that I couldn't put my finger on. Weirded out, I replied back, "Just Colton." After I yelled that back to her, I found a good place to hide the bottle and began walking up the stairs to the next level. Now, as I was walking up the stairs, I couldn't help but feel the overbearing silence in the house, and the slight electric twinge that something isn't right. When I got to the top of the steps, I look over to where the door to the garage is, and also the kitchen right next to it, and it's black, pitch black. All of the lights were off, and there was no moonlight shining through any windows. I walked over to the kitchen, yelling out, "Mom, where are you?" There was no reply, just silence and darkness. I feel the electric twinge and turn into full needles, and my adrenaline kicking into full force. I have to get out of here as fast as possible. My mother was not home. I run back down the stairs, grabbing my coat along the way. "What's wrong?" Colton says. "My mom's not home," I reply as fast as I can, looking for my truck keys. "What do you mean? You were just talking with her?" I could see the confusion in his face. "There's no one home. We need to leave now." I took a few steps toward the back door that opens up to the yard, and then I see my dog shaking on the couch and my cat growling behind it. I couldn't leave them. I just knew that if we left, something would happen. "Are we leaving?" Colton said, still confused as all hell. "No, I can't leave them here alone. Something is really off. I'm going to call my mom and figure this out." I pull out my phone and call my mom. She picks up immediately. "Meow Zimbu? What's going on?" she answers. "Mom, were you just home? I heard you yelling for me from the second level, and when I went up, you weren't there," I said frantically, hoping that she was playing a joke. "No, I'm just leaving the bar. I wasn't feeling very well. Are you okay?" "What do you mean you heard me?" I fill her in on the whole story, and she rushes home. Colton and I stayed in the basement with the animals until she got home. But before she did, you could hear something upstairs. Not walking or sitting on things, but a pressure in the air, like a black hole was slowly moving from one room to the next. And the word that I would instinctively describe it as is hungry. When she got home, you could feel the thing leave just as quick as it came, like an overbearing predatory presence had just flown away. We still have never figured out what the hell was going on, and this is just one story of many unexplainable things that have happened to us. But this is the easiest to write down, and one that I was happy to have a witness. My mother has passed away now, and I have moved away to Arizona. But whenever I go back to Iowa and I see Colton, he still gets creeped out by what had happened. I will never truly know what happened, but I know that whatever it was that had my mother's voice, it was evil and it was hungry. Help me, I'm lost. This is my first post, and it is a true story. I was living in a rural area of Oklahoma with my mother at a small lake house, and I'm probably 10 or 11 at this time. One night, I'm sleeping in my room when I randomly and abruptly wake up for no reason. This was not normal for me, and I felt very uneasy. The only sound I could hear was my mother snoring in the next room on the couch. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but my need to use the bathroom was growing more urgent, so I grudgingly forced myself to head that way. The bathroom is on the other side of the house, around a corner and past the kitchen, and finally down a long hallway on the right. So after I made the trip and finished my business, I flipped off the light switch and started heading back to bed. That's when I heard the distinct click of the light switch and saw the glow of the bathroom light in the hallway. Terrified, I slowly turned around just to witness the light in the bathroom start clicking on and off. Click, 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 click. Finally, it shut completely off. In the dark of the hallway, my eyes began to make out a white shape near the end of the hall. It was around my size and crouched to the floor. At this point, I'm frozen to the spot as my mind begins realizing that no one else is home except for my mom and myself. Then the white shape began whispering in a quiet man's voice, "Help me, I'm lost." I remember wanting to scream for my mom, but I couldn't, and instead, I barely said no. Before this thing starts running at me on what sounded like all fours, I quickly ran through the kitchen and around the corner before running to my sleeping mother, shaking her awake. I remember saying, "It's coming, it's coming," and my mother's eyes going from dazed to alert in an instant. She asked me what was going on, and I saw her eyes look over my shoulder before she screamed. Remembering her scream still makes my blood run cold. Never had I heard pure terror like that in my life, even to this day. She grabs me by the arms and pulls me into my room and slams the door. She holds me in her arms with her back pressed against the door as we listen. It sounded like this thing was running around in circles in the kitchen. We could hear hands and feet slapping against the tile. The kitchen had a sliding glass door to the outside, which sounded like it was thrown open and slammed. We sat there, horrified, until daybreak. I was sent to my grandmother's in the next town for a while after that, and never set foot in that house again. Years later, my mother said she went walking around the property after the incident and came across a small burial site with 3 headstones that each belonged to children from the early 1900s. It freaks me out because what I heard that night was a man's voice, but it was so unnatural. My mom still will not tell me what she saw behind me and what it was that made her scream. She tells me she's afraid it will know we're talking about it and it will come back. This is the first of many weird things that have happened in my life. Horrifying quarantine experience. I was upstairs in my room one night, playing video games with the volume really loud, when I thought I heard noises coming from downstairs. I muted the TV and listened closer. Nothing. I resumed playing the game for another hour when I heard it again, only louder. I was sure I heard it this time and was a little freaked out. To assure myself, I went downstairs to the basement where I thought I heard the noise coming from. As soon as I opened the basement door, I was hit with a cold breeze. I went downstairs and saw the window wide open. I was 100% sure I had closed and locked all the windows in the house. I was ready to make a run for it when something stopped me. I turned around and for the first time noticed the closet door was slightly cracked open. I stood for what seemed like 30 minutes in front of that door, debating whether I should open it. I moved closer and put my hand on the doorknob. All of a sudden, I heard a creepy crackle coming from inside the closet. I have never run faster up a flight of stairs before. I locked the door and called the cops, who had an unusually fast response time. They came in and searched the house, and not even 5 minutes into their search, I heard a gunshot from downstairs. A few minutes later, they came out with a deranged-looking man, probably homeless. They put him in the back of the car and told me they had opened the door and the man was holding a gun shot at them and missed. He luckily missed, and the cops disarmed him and arrested him. The scariest part was how close I was to opening that door and likely being murdered. How was my father in two places at once? First off, a little backstory on my dad. The man has so much character and color to him. Though he is mostly a chilled out grandpa at this point, whose biggest offenses are the likes of placing a box of dead kittens in the Topic Cat when the family plays charades at the Christmas Eve get-together. When I was a kid, he was a crazy person. He was an amazing father, honest to a fault, and had character made of stone. He apologized when he felt he was wrong, and he would sit and cry with you when things were eating away at your self-esteem. However, as much as I owe him my morality and compassion towards others, I also owe him my extremely demented and nothing is sacred sense of humor. The man got more joy from life in tormenting his children than anything else. We lived on my grandmother's farm in rural Tennessee, and when the power would go out, which happened a lot in our area, he would dare me to run to the mailbox and then lock me outside at 10 o'clock at night when I'm about 10 years old. And he would laugh so hard I could hear him over my screams while I banged on the door from the outside, pleading to be let back in. He was the type of dad to wake you up in the morning by revving a chainsaw, change the clocks in the house to make you get ready for school at 2 a.m., and stand on the porch in his tidy whities while you were getting on the bus in the morning and yell, "I love you, I'm gonna miss you so bad," in a voice that could only imply that he was suffering from severe brain damage. In other words, he was always looking for a way to scare you, embarrass you, or just make you have such a crazy, unexpected experience that you would be guaranteed to remember him forever. And it worked. I love that man. Now, that was needed for context. And this story takes place in my second to last year on my grandmother's farm. I was 17 and had been working a job in my small town, stocking beer coolers and mopping floors at the local gas station. I was driving home from work in my little truck at about 10 p.m., and as I pulled into the driveway, my headlights shone up the hill to my grandmother's house and panned down the hill to the edge of our single-wide mobile home. I stopped immediately. All 4 tires in the driveway, pointing straight to the end of that straight stretch of gravel. I could see my dad. His old flatbed truck and my stepmother's minivan were parked pointing to the left at the base of our trailer. He was standing behind them, with his back to my headlights. Our chocolate lab, Cassie, sat at his feet, staring intently at him, paying no attention to the vehicle entering her territory, which was highly unlike her. I only stopped because it was so late and so unusual for my dad to be outside at this time. It was in the middle of the week. He was usually passed out in his recliner wearing nothing but his underwear with the History Channel quietly rambling on about the Civil War by this time. I slowly proceeded down the driveway. Our driveway was about half a football field in length, and as I drove slowly toward the bottom of the driveway, My dad began to walk, still with his back turned to me, and stepped behind the vehicles, the height of my stepmom's van fully concealing him. It took another 15 seconds from that point for me to reach the end of the driveway, and I pulled my truck in on the side of his flatbed, leaving me closest to the road. I grabbed my big gulp and got out of the truck. "Dad?" No response. "Dad?" Still nothing. Immediately I got a bit creeped out, but then thought to myself nearly as quick, this dude is trying to scare me again. He must think I didn't see him. I got down on my knee and peered under the vehicles. His left boot, unmistakable. Cassie's back legs and butt right beside him, tail tucked between her legs. I hollered out, "You're doing a crappy job of hiding, Dad. I can see your boot sticking out from behind the tire on the van." I watched as his left boot slowly slid to the right until it was concealed behind the tire with the other. Still no response. I called for the dog. "Cassie!" She turned and literally scurried beneath the vehicles to get to me as if she was under heavy gunfire. She was whimpering when she got to me and acting very strange, as if she was terrified. She was acting how I would imagine a dog would act if they were constantly beat on, and I had never seen her behave that way before. When she got to me and I placed my hand on her, you could almost hear her breathe a sigh of relief. She was sticking to my legs like glue, and as I was still down on one knee and a bit off balance, she nearly knocked me over. I pet on her for a moment and tried to comfort her, but she seemed like she was afraid of something. With her tail still tucked between her legs, she pushed herself in between my legs as I stood up. It was after seeing how timid and odd Cassie was acting that I decided that I may be misreading the situation, and I might need to get into the house. My dad was surely a prankster, but when he was caught, he was caught. He never drug things out once we caught on. He would come out and say something like, "I guess you kids ain't as gullible as you used to be. I'm gonna have to start stepping it up a notch." Dad didn't drink much, and never got drunk really, but I couldn't think of what the root of this odd behavior could possibly be, and it really started to weird me out. I made one last attempt at communication. "Dad, I know you're there. I saw you when I pulled in the driveway. The jig is up. What are you doing out here?" No response. I started around the front of my truck to round the vehicles and walk over to him. Cassie began to panic and whimper loudly, still glued to the inside of my ankles, crouched to the gravel with her head darting back and forth wildly. I stopped in front of my truck. I stand there for another moment in silence, waiting for something, but not sure what, and then announce, "Well, I'm heading in. See you in a bit, weirdo." I turned to walk to the front porch, unconsciously building speed as I hit the first step. Cassie drops back and doesn't follow me onto the porch, but seems to sort of stand guard at the foot of the steps. Keys in hand, I'm already searching for the deadbolt key. Panic is building in my chest, but I'm not sure why. I hurriedly unlock the door and jump into the house, swing around and slam the door behind me, locking the deadbolt all in one fluid motion. From behind me, I hear a voice yell, "What the hell?" I spin around. My big gulp drops to the floor and explodes across the living room floor. There sits my dad, in his underwear, sitting up from a deep sleep in his recliner. I begin to hyperventilate and yell through gasps of air that there's a man in the driveway hiding behind the van. "I thought he was you. I was talking to him, Dad." I nearly collapsed into the floor. Within 15 seconds, my dad is running out the back door of the house with a spotlight and a handgun, still wearing nothing but his underwear. He was outside for what felt like forever. When he came in, he was pale as a sheet. He said someone was definitely out there, but he couldn't see them. He could hear them running, but when he pointed the spotlight in the direction of the footsteps, there was no one there. Crazy thing is, our trailer sat at the front of a 150-acre cornfield, and it was off-season, so everything was tilled down to the dirt. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. It was a terrifying experience, and I know it's one that seems easy to explain. My brain really wants to tell me that I had just foiled a car thief or something, or maybe even stopped a possible home invasion. The thing is, though, my dad has an unmistakable posture, and an even more unmistakable walk. I know those were his boots I saw under the van. I also know that if he had somehow set all this up, I would have heard about it for years, because it would have been one of his favorite stories to tell, how he scared me so bad when I was 17, and how funny it would have been. He does tell people about this from time to time, but he always ends with the same detail, that it wasn't until he was outside running around in his underwear with a handgun that I realized that Cassie had been sleeping in the floor next to his recliner when I ran in the door. The first thing that happened to me on my grandmother's farm. I was about 11 when this happened. My older cousin Daniel, about 13, and I were playing hide and seek outside in my grandmother's yard. She owned a large farm in Tennessee, just over 1,000 acres, and I grew up there my entire life, and so did Daniel. So it was nothing for us to wander off and play in areas that probably weren't very safe for the average kid. But we knew the property like the back of our hand. It just so happened that the day before this happened, a lot of trees were cut down to make room for a new mobile home by the side of the road that she intended to rent out for extra income. Daniel and I naturally gravitated toward this new unfamiliar landscape to play, because it was something new to explore. All of the trees had been stripped of their branches and placed in logging trucks and hauled off. The branches, however, were all piled in a tangled mess about 50 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet tall. They were packed so densely that you couldn't see through them from one side to the other. It was during about the half-hour mark, when it was my turn to find Daniel, that I began to suspect that he was hiding in the woods deeper than our stated rules allowed. I remember calling his name for several minutes and hearing nothing but a quiet giggle coming from the woods. I was in the newly cut clearing, looking into the woods and getting more upset by the minute. Finally, I announced as loudly as I could that if he wasn't going to play fairly, then I was going in to get a glass of tea and watch television with Grandma. I started back up the hill toward the house. It was at that moment I was walking past the brush pile, basically centered beside it, that I heard an unfamiliar voice. "You gave up quickly." I stopped. I called out, "Daniel?" It didn't sound like Daniel, but the voice responded, "Yes, I am Daniel. I am inside of the limbs." I looked at the brush pile and didn't see anyone. Again, I heard the odd voice call out, "If you do not see me, then you have not found me, and I will have won the game." I stepped closer and yelled out to the voice, "Why are you talking so funny?" The voice replied, "I am inside of all the limbs. Look inside and you will see me, Daniel." Something felt really strange about the way this guy was talking, but 11-year-old me just rationalized it, thinking, maybe his voice sounds different behind the shrubbery, and he sounds like he's talking funny because his voice sounds different. I stepped up to the edge of the brush pile and pulled the branches apart to look inside, and there was Daniel. His head was turned toward the top of the hill, but his body was facing me. I yelled out, "I caught you!" His head shifted toward me, and he had the single most disgusting smile I've ever seen to this very day. Imagine if someone has the absolute worst of intentions, and they're trying to hide behind a fake innocent smile to gain your trust, but they couldn't help their glee with the thought that they may have fooled you. That's the best way I can describe the smile. I was so shocked by this wicked facial expression on my cousin's face that I froze in place, the hairs on my neck and arms all raised, and I could suddenly feel my blood running through my body like the temperature had dropped inside my veins. I stammered through my words. How did you get in there?" He responded, "I fell into the inside of the limbs, cousin. I will need you to give me help or I will continue to be trapped." I didn't notice this time how oddly he phrased his sentences, and it only occurred to me afterward that his lips were not moving when he spoke. He never changed his face from the twisted, unnerving smile. I didn't immediately notice any of these things, because I was too distracted by the large stick that was plunged deeply into the side of his neck. I noticed in that moment that he had a slow, steady, trickling stream of blood flowing from the half-dollar-sized stick in his neck and down across his right shoulder and down his chest. This was enough to jolt my feet awake, and before my brain realized I was trying to run, I was already halfway up the hill to my grandmother's house. When I burst through the door to my grandmother's living room, Daniel was curled up in a ball on the couch and crying hysterically. My grandmother was sitting beside him, trying her best to get him to explain what was wrong, but all he would say is that there was a little boy in the woods who tagged him when he was hiding, and he thought it wasn't really me. He wouldn't say anything else. I was crying and shaken up by this point, and told my grandmother what I had seen. She made both of us some lunch and then called my uncle to come pick Daniel up. I stayed at my grandmother's house that night, and I bet she asked me what happened 100 times. She asked so many questions, it was as if she was committing it to memory. I remember being relieved that she believed me, but at the same time, I just wanted her to tell me it was all in my imagination and help me forget about it. The next day, my grandmother set the brush pile on fire, and I watched for hours from the safety of the living room window as it slowly deteriorated into a pile of ash and ember. My cousin never did tell me what really happened to him that day. He refuses to talk about it. I will say this, though. He wouldn't talk to me for a year and a half after that day. We were so close when we were little. But that event, whatever the hell it was, it drove a wedge between us that changed our relationship forever. My childhood friend. When I was a child, I had a friend named Lucy. She was a neighborhood girl who would come over to my grandmother's house, which was where I lived at the time. There was a park by my house that had a deep creek next to it. I couldn't swim, so we always had to have an adult with us when near the creek. Lucy was always a toxic friend, but I didn't know. She would always threaten to stop being friends with me or stop talking to me if I didn't do what she wanted. She would also always say that she deserved my toys and my family and friends more than I did. I didn't mind this, as I had a hard time making friends, and Lucy was one of my only friends. One night, Lucy came over and she said she was bored and wanted to go to the park. I told her my family was in the backyard, and we had to have an adult with us to go, but she said she would leave and never come back if we didn't go to the park with her. I followed her, and we went to the park. She walked right past the playground equipment to the creek, and I asked her what she was doing. She said she wanted to swim, and I told her I couldn't swim, and she called me a string of hurtful names, including weak, stupid, and an awful friend. This really hurt my 5-year-old self, so I started crying. This made her even angrier, and she told me something I'll never forget. "You're an awful child. Your family deserved me and not you." I was so confused and sad that I just ran home. I never saw her again, and I just thought she was so angry she never really spoke to me again. Now, about a year ago, my family was talking about my many imaginary friends, and my mom said my friend Lucy really creeped her out because she was supposed to have a daughter before me who they wanted to name Lucy. My mother had a miscarriage, and Lucy was never born. I talked to something who wasn't my sister. So this is my first time ever writing anything like this. But I wanted to get some sort of closure for what I experienced when I was younger. For some context, we moved into our current house, and the house that this story takes place in, when I was like 3 years old. It is a 2-story building completed sometime in the early 2000s. There are 3 bedrooms on the second floor. The master bedroom is to the left of this little walkway at the end of the staircase. Right next to it, on the right, was the room my younger sister and I used to sleep in when we were younger. And the last room, which was meant to be used as my younger brother's room once he got older, was all the way at the end of the hallway. But that room always remained empty and used as a storage room for the most part. When I was around 7 to 8 years old, I had developed this new schedule of after-school procrastination. I would shower and then sit on my parents' bed to watch PBS in my mom's bedroom. She had the biggest TV and by far the better graphics than the other televisions around the house at the time. The TV sat on top of a large drawer chest in front of her bed. My sister, who was a year and a half younger than me, would usually sit with me to watch whatever was playing. We particularly loved when Curious George came on, so we would always be out of the shower and dressed by 3:50, the latest, considering the show came on at 4. I never really felt anything off about the room, at least not when the sun was still out, but I always had this feeling about it once it became dark. It's a feeling I still get to this day as a 20-year-old. I just can't walk by it late at night without getting the heebie-jeebies. Something always felt off about it, especially when I was younger. I hated being upstairs by myself, even during the daytime. However, on this particular day, for whatever reason, I was up there by myself. It was around October, November-ish, and as a result, they were playing an hour-long special for Curious George. I honestly can't remember whether it was the Halloween or Thanksgiving one, but it was a movie sort of special. All I know is that I loved it enough to sit up there by myself and watch it. I was at least a good 15 to 20 minutes in when I heard a noise from outside in the hallway. I thought it was my sister, so I ignored it. At some point, my sister came in and proceeded to stand right in front of the TV. My sister had this annoying habit of standing in front of any big screen and blocking the view for everyone. And while she wasn't really blocking my view, I knew my mom hated it when she just stood there. She said it was rude or something along those lines. Although, in that particular moment, I didn't care. There had been this scene that was particularly funny that my sister had missed a part of, only getting to watch the other half. I began to tell her what had happened before, proceeding to laugh, expecting her to laugh too. But I didn't get a response, which annoyed me a bit, so I proceeded to say the same thing again. Yet, I still didn't get a response from her. She stood still, glancing at the TV and away from me. Because I was on my mom's bed and the TV was right in front of me, all I could see was her back. The third time I got no response, I grew irritated, yelling her name and telling her to stop ignoring me and to look at me. That's when she turned around. Except it wasn't my sister. I mean, it looked like her, wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing earlier, same everything, but her eyes were off. All I remember was how unsettling the eyes were, being all pitch black, not to mention the emotionless expression aimed at me. We both stared at each other for a while before it turned around and proceeded to walk out of the room. I was still a bit weary, but then I got really angry because I was just blatantly ignored. So, I got up and also walked out of the room. I yelled for my mom, tattling that my sister had just ignored me and left while I was talking to her like an idiot. My mom's voice was confused as she yelled back that that couldn't be possible. My sister had been downstairs with her the whole time. I asked if maybe she had gone upstairs at some point and she just hadn't realized, but she said no. And even if she had, she would have heard the squeaking of the floorboards that are right by her room. I was baffled, but thought I had maybe been seeing things. Yet, after that, I didn't feel comfortable being in that room by myself anymore, and decided to stay downstairs with my mom for a while. I have experienced other weird things that just can't be explained, but I often think about this one instance and wonder what it was that I talked to that day. If anyone has any idea or guesses as to what I could have been talking to, please let me know. The creep in the woods that underestimated me. I had a summer job when I was a 15-year-old girl that was a few miles from my house. I lived in a rural wooded area, and my parents never let me go into the woods by myself. But they worked days, and my job started at noon every day, so I had to walk to work. I chose to disobey them and walk through the woods to work because it cut about a mile off my walk. So every day, at the same time, I'd walk through the very much abandoned state forest down a deer path for a mile or so until it intercepted a railroad track. Then I'd walk a couple more miles down the railroad tracks into town to my job. Stupid, I know, but I was 15. Taking this path always freaked me out, and I always felt like I was being watched. But it was shorter and less sunny and less hot, and so I ignored my instincts, thinking my parents' influence was just making me paranoid. My parents would pick me up after my shift, unaware of my daily routine. This continued for weeks. One day, I'm walking, about a mile from any houses, deep in the woods, and there are two porn magazine pages that had been ripped out and placed on the trail facing me. They hadn't been there the day before. I was completely creeped out, as they were clearly intentionally placed, and probably for me, since very few people utilized this area. But I kept walking, because if I turned around at this point, I'd have further to go to get out of the woods, and then there was a huge hill to climb to get back to my house, and no one would be around there to help me anyway. This was a densely wooded area with brambles and dogwood and rolling hills, so I couldn't see very far in any direction. Suddenly, I could hear someone else walking close by. I stopped, and I would hear them for a split second, and then they would stop. They sounded like they had change in their pocket, so I knew it wasn't an animal, but because of the echo, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Just to check that I wasn't crazy, I stopped once more and heard the same noise, which quickly stopped when I stopped. That's when I knew I was being stalked. My heart was racing with fear, and my vision went blurry, but my instincts told me not to speak and not to run, but just keep walking down the dense deer path further into the woods. My gut told me not to look behind me. I could sense there was someone right behind me on the deer path now, but I did not look back. Now, I'm a rather short, slightly chubby person, and looking at me, you'd probably assume that I couldn't run very fast. So if you wanted to catch me deep in the woods, you might assume you had plenty of time to do so. And looking back, I think this is exactly what the creep was thinking. But back then, I ran cross country and track, and could run a 7-minute mile, and hills were my specialty. I always placed really well on hilly terrain. By no means was I a great runner, but certainly I was likely faster than whatever pedo creep was hanging out in the woods stalking a little girl. It's not that I was processing this thought at the time, I just instinctually knew not to run. Yet. I kept walking, seemingly deeper into the woods because I knew the train track was up ahead, where there would be more space to run without tripping or getting caught in the tree branches. It was terrifying to not look back, but something told me not to. While I walked, I felt like my entire body was shutting down. It's a feeling I've never felt before or after that day. It was the feeling of being prey. Everything went blurry, and I could feel blood pulsing in my ears, and my heart was pounding. I just kept walking like nothing was happening, and did not turn around, but I could feel someone maybe 5 or 10 feet behind me at this point, following me for a good 1/8 of a mile. I didn't turn around. I didn't scream, because I knew no one would hear me. As soon as I got near the train tracks, which were elevated along a man-made gravel mound, I ran. And then I ran on all fours up the hill, gripping onto weeds to pull myself up faster, and then I sprinted along the tracks as fast as my lungs and legs could carry me. I heard and saw branches snapping below me in the woods, but now I was out in the sun and the woods were dark, so I couldn't see what was behind the branches. I just kept sprinting. I never even saw the person, but I knew their intentions were awful. I never cut through the woods again, and I didn't mention what happened to my parents until I was 18 and had moved out of the house. I was too afraid of being grounded. I spoke for the last time last night. I've been living alone for the last 2 years. Fresh out of college, I got a very stable and very isolating job in work-from-home data entry for a large medical company out west. I have always been a keep-to-myself kind of person, and I never really had any friends that didn't last through the next grade or semester. I just never found myself as someone who got much out of long-term company and interaction. I had plenty of so-called friends drop me when they moved to different states and cut all contact. These experiences of having someone and then losing them have turned me off from friendships and relationships altogether. I know it's not healthy for me, but at the end of the day, I always find comfort in knowing that I will always have myself to keep me company. I found a great 3rd-floor apartment near where I went to school, and being very familiar with the area after 4 years, moved myself in from my dorm with no trouble. Remote work from home in my field has many benefits, usually just a super simple population of data on spreadsheets or systems of medical data and records. No meetings or calls daily, nor reason to ever be on a mic or camera. Due to its sensitivity, it pays very well, and I have made myself a good and simple, albeit quiet life post-grad. Everything my loner self could have dreamed of. One thing you start to notice when you live alone is how few times a day, or even a week, you actually talk or say something. I had no coworkers, roommates, or even pets to talk to, and sometimes would find myself going entire days without speaking a word. I didn't tend to go out and would spend my nights gaming or reading, or in a silent workout at the gym. It is a strangely peaceful existence, not having to talk or hold any conversations. When I would talk at a restaurant, to the doctor, or to my mom on one of her monthly calls, I would often have an odd experience hearing my voice, as if it was the voice of another being projected through me. Usually, just an odd feeling to shake off, like how it feels to eat a food you have not eaten for a while, a sensory adjustment to the now changed world around me. This had never been something I had dwelt on in the past, as usually I would go a day or two before eventually having to talk, never really thinking of it as a disturbing or unusual experience. That was until last night. I never typically ordered in food, but I had done so today after a busy day in systems and spreadsheets. I caved and ordered some pizza from a nearby restaurant online through a delivery app and had it sent to my door. I always selected the no contact or leave at door option. Chalk it up to my growing antisocial personality. But if I could minimize any human interaction and maintain my almost monastic vow of silence, it was a win for me. As I pushed back onto my living room couch, I waited for my food, which was to arrive in a few minutes. This peace was shattered by a firm but gentle knock on my door. Odd, I thought to myself, as I checked the leave at door option. But mistakes happen. I was not pressed over it at all, especially as someone who had driven for a similar delivery app during the pandemic. As I approached the door, I was greeted by a perfectly normal-looking, ordinary, taller brown-haired man who smiled and handed the box to me. He said the following in a carefree and airy tone of voice. "Have a good rest of your night and enjoy, sir. Looking forward to hearing from you soon." I crinkled my nose at that last part, but took the box and nodded to him curtly, saying thank you while shutting the door. I noticed he stood outside my door for about 5 seconds before walking away and whistling a tune to himself. At the time, I assumed he just expected a good review, which I gave him on the app. But something about that hearing from you soon didn't quite sit right with me. I am beginning to realize what he might have meant. The rest of the evening went off without a note. I devoured the pizza and went to throw the box away. It was at this point I noticed the top of the pizza box had been cut into a few times by what I assumed was the knife or slicer at the restaurant, but it looked off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it looked less like random cuts and more like deliberate attempts to write. I could make out no recognizable words and symbols, so I took the benefit of the doubt and threw the box out. I took a shower and went to bed with nothing amiss. That all changed this morning. I was woken up that next day by a phone call, which would have been a cause for alarm, but it was from my mom, one of her usual monthly check-in calls. I picked up the phone and spoke into it. "Hey, Mom." Or, at least, I attempted to speak that into it. Instead, all that came out of my throat was a dusty and almost wind-like shrill into the receiver. I attempted to clear my throat, chalking it up to just waking up, and tried again. Nothing. Every time I tried to speak, the only sound that could be heard was a shrill and guttural rushing sound that sounded like and felt like a dagger to my lungs, like as if they had been penetrated with a knife, and the rushing sound of air out of them could be heard as I attempted to speak. My mom said my name several times and eventually hung up as I frantically tried to speak. I ended up texting her and lying, saying I was doing well and was having tech issues, but would call her later. I tried looking at my mouth and throat in a mirror and saw nothing amiss. Tried drinking water and making tea with honey, but there was nothing I could do to get my voice back. Eating and swallowing were perfectly normal, but I could not speak no matter how hard I tried. A bit panicked, I found a doctor who was open on the weekend and grabbed my keys to hop into my car to race there as fast as I could. I hoped it wouldn't be any trouble, that I had not called before. Obviously, I couldn't with my lack of voice. As I opened the door to run to my car, I was stopped dead in my tracks, faced with the same man who had delivered my food to me yesterday. As soon as I opened my mouth to shout, and in my surprise, I heard a voice. "Told you I would be hearing from you soon." It was not the shrill and nasally voice I had heard yesterday when the food was dropped off. No, it was my voice, crawling its way from his lips through the wry smile he wore on his face. He gave me a wink and walked out toward the stairs leading down from my apartment, leaving me standing in front of the door in horror of what I had seen and heard. It was at this point that I realized I had not lost my voice. It had been taken from me. Somehow this thing I took for granted had been stolen from me. I don't think any doctors are going to be able to help me. I do not know what I can do. Someone else has my voice. I took a babysitting job for an 18-year-old boy. Now I know why the other babysitters left abruptly. I never should have taken that babysitting job. The moment I stepped into that suburban nightmare, I knew something was off. But I needed the money. And honestly, how bad could watching an 18-year-old be? Turns out, pretty fucking bad. It all started when I saw the ad online. Babysitter needed for 18-year-old son. Great pay, flexible hours. I know what you're thinking. Why the hell does an 18-year-old need a babysitter? That's exactly what I asked Mrs. Doll Van when I showed up for the interview. "Oh, Robert's special," she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "He needs supervision, someone to make sure he takes his medication, doesn't leave the house, that sort of thing." I nodded, trying not to let my confusion show. The pay was incredible, way more than I'd ever made babysitting before, and as a broke college student, I couldn't afford to be picky. "There's just one more thing," Mr. Dollvan added, his deep voice startling me. I hadn't even noticed him enter the room. "The last few babysitters, well, they didn't work out. Left rather abruptly, I'm afraid. But I'm sure that won't be a problem with you, will it, Adriana?" Something in his tone made me want to run, but I pushed the feeling aside. "Of course not, sir. I'm very reliable." And that's how I found myself alone in the Doll Van house on a Friday night, wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. The house itself was normal enough. A typical suburban two-story with a manicured lawn and a white picket fence. But something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way the floorboards creaked even when no one was walking on them, or how the air felt thick and heavy, like the house was holding its breath. Robert was in his room when I arrived. Mrs. Doll Van introduced us briefly before she and her husband left for their date night. "Remember, Adriana," she said, her hand gripping my arm just a little too tightly. "Robert doesn't leave his room after 8 p.m., and whatever you do, don't go into the basement." I laughed nervously. "Why? You got a monster down there or something?" Neither of them smiled. Mr. Doll Van just said, "The basement door stays locked, for everyone's safety." And with that cheerful goodbye, they were gone, leaving me alone with Robert and a house full of secrets. For the first few hours, everything was fine. Robert stayed in his room, only emerging once to grab a snack. He barely spoke 2 words to me, just nodded and disappeared back upstairs. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that things started to get weird. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. A soft thump, like something heavy hitting the floor. Then another, and another. It was coming from the basement. My heart started racing. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the thumps kept coming, growing louder and more insistent. And then I heard something else. A voice, muffled but unmistakable, calling out for help. Fuck. I knew I shouldn't go down there. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming at me to get the hell out of that house. But what if someone was hurt? What if the doll vans had been in an accident and somehow ended up trapped in their own basement? I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. I flicked on my flashlight and peered down the stairs. Nothing but darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone down there?" No response. Just more thumping. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs. Each step creaked and groaned under my weight, and I swear I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. When I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight around the room. It looked like a normal basement at first. Washing machine, dryer, some old boxes piled in corners. But then my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. A door. A door that shouldn't be there, hidden behind a stack of boxes. As I approached it, the thumping grew louder. It was definitely coming from behind that door. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to run out of the house and never look back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. I tried to turn the knob, but it was locked. Panic rising in my throat, I pressed my ear against the wood. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible. Help. My flashlight beam caught something. A thin crack between the door and the frame. I leaned in close, trying to peek through. An eye. A human eye, wide with fear, staring back at me through the crack. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. What the fuck was going on in this house? I was about to try breaking down the door when I heard footsteps upstairs. Robert, or Mr. Doll Van, or whoever the hell was really living in this house. In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. I knew I couldn't let them know I'd discovered whatever sick secret they were hiding down here. Not if I wanted to make it out alive. I raced back up the stairs as quietly as I could, locking the basement door behind me. I had just settled back onto the couch, trying to control my breathing, when Robert appeared at the top of the stairs. "Everything okay down here?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I forced a smile. "Yeah, all good. Just watching some TV." He nodded, his eyes boring into me like he could see right through my lie. Then he turned and went back to his room. As soon as he was gone, I let out a shaky breath. I knew I should run, should call the police, should go do anything but stay in this house of horrors. But the image of that eye pleading for help was burned into my mind. And the reality of my situation hit me hard. I was broke, desperate. I needed this job, at least for a few more nights until I could figure out what to do. So I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to stay, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to come back tomorrow night and the night after that, until I could find a way to help whoever was trapped in that basement. Little did I know, I was walking right into a nightmare that was far worse than anything I could have imagined.
I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that terrified eye staring back at me through the crack in the basement door. But I had to go back. I needed the money, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone down there needed my help. The next night, I arrived at the Dollvan house with a pit in my stomach. Mrs. Dollvan greeted me with that same plastic smile. "Oh, Adriana, we're so glad you came back," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "So many babysitters find Robert challenging." I forced a smile. "No problems here, Mrs. Dollvan. Robert's a breeze." As soon as they left, I started planning. I needed to find a way into that basement room, but I couldn't risk getting caught. I spent the first few hours pretending everything was normal, checking on Robert periodically and watching TV with the volume up to mask any sounds I might make. Around midnight, I heard Robert's door close. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my phone and the flashlight I'd brought from home. This time I was prepared. The basement was just as creepy as I remembered. My heart pounded as I approached the hidden door, praying it would somehow be unlocked this time. No such luck. I pressed my ear against the wood. "Hello?" I whispered. "Is anyone there?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, so faint I almost missed it. "Please, help us." Us. There was more than one person down there. I fumbled with my phone, pulling up the lock-picking video I'd watched earlier. It looked so easy online, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the bobby pins steady. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard a soft click. The door creaked open, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Sweat, blood, and something worse. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a nightmare. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, and it was full of people. Young women, mostly, crammed together like sardines. Some were barely conscious. Others stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Oh my God," I breathed. "What the fuck is this?" One of the girls, her face gaunt and her eyes sunken, spoke up. "You're the new babysitter, aren't you?" Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't used it in a long time. "They always bring in a new one when they take one of us." The implications of her words made me want to vomit. I don't understand. Who are you? What is this place?" "We're the other babysitters," another girl said. "The ones who left abruptly." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, in normal suburbs with white picket fences. "We have to get you out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll call the police. No!" Several of them shouted at once, then immediately hushed, glancing fearfully at the ceiling. "You can't," the first girl said. "They'll know. They always know. And then you'll end up down here with us. And then the next babysitter will come, and the cycle will continue." But a noise from upstairs cut me off. Footsteps. "Go!" one of the girls hissed. "Before they catch you. But please, don't leave us here. Find a way to help us." I wanted to argue, to insist on getting them out right now. But I knew she was right. If I got caught, I couldn't help anyone. I closed the door, my hand shaking so bad I could barely lock it. I had just made it back upstairs when Robert appeared in the living room doorway. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. I forced a smile. "Just getting a glass of water." Thought I heard a noise, but it was nothing. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes boring into mine like he could see right through my lie. Then he nodded. "Get some sleep, Adriana. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As I watched him climb the stairs, a chill ran down my spine. Somehow, I knew he was right. Tomorrow was going to be very long indeed. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The faces of those girls haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I spent the night researching, trying to find any information about missing persons in the area, about the doll vans, and anything that could help me make sense of this nightmare. I found nothing. It was like the doll vans didn't exist outside of this house. The next evening, I arrived at the house with a plan. It wasn't a good plan, but it was all I had. I'd smuggled in my laptop, a portable Wi-Fi hotspot, and a small camera. If I couldn't get the girls out tonight, I'd at least get proof to take to the police. Mrs. Doll Van greeted me with that same plastic smile. "Adriana, dear, we're so pleased you're settling in well. Robert seems quite fond of you." The way she said it made my skin crawl. As soon as they left, I set up my laptop in the living room, the camera pointed at the basement door. Then I waited. Hours passed. Robert stayed in his room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft click, like a lock turning. Then footsteps coming up from the basement. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The basement door opened, and Mr. Doll Van stepped out. But he wasn't alone. He was dragging one of the girls from the hidden room. I bit back a scream. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, her mouth gagged. She looked right at me, silently pleading for help. Mr. Doll Van didn't notice me. He was too focused on his task, pulling the girl toward the front door. I knew I should do something. Call the police, scream, anything. But I was frozen in place, watching in horror as he opened the front door and shoved the girl into a waiting van. As soon as the door closed behind him, I sprang into action. I grabbed my laptop and ran to the basement. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the lock, but finally the door swung open. "We have to go, now," I whispered urgently to the remaining girls. "This is our chance." They looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. Slowly, painfully, they began to move. We were halfway up the basement stairs when the lights flicked on. Robert stood at the top of the stairs, a gun in his hand. Behind him, Mr. and Mrs. Doll Van smiled those terrible plastic smiles. "Oh, Adriana," Mrs. Doll Van sighed. "We had such high hopes for you. But I suppose you'll have to join our little family after all." I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could, something hard connected with the back of my head. The world went black. When I came to, I was in the hidden room. The other girls were gone. I was alone. No, not alone. Robert sat in the corner, watching me with those eerily calm eyes. "Why?" I croaked. "Why are you doing this?" He smiled, and for the first time I saw something human in his eyes. Something sad. "Because," he said softly, "I was the first Robert, the first babysitter, and now you'll be the next Mrs. Doll Van." As the meaning of his words sank in, I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Mr. and Mrs. Doll Van stood there, syringes in hand. "Welcome to the family, Adriana," Mr. Doll Van said. "It's time for your first lesson." But as they approached, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to become another victim. I wasn't going to let this cycle continue. In a burst of adrenaline, I lunged forward, catching them off guard. I knocked the syringes from their hands and pushed past them, my heart pounding in my ears. I heard shouts behind me as I raced up the basement stairs, taking them two at a time. I had to get out. I had to get help. As I reached the main floor, I could hear them coming after me, but I had youth and desperation on my side. I sprinted for the front door, my fingers fumbling with the lock. Just as I heard footsteps on the stairs, I wrenched the door open and burst into the cool night air. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, not daring to look back. I could hear voices behind me, but they grew fainter as I put distance between myself and that house of horrors. I didn't stop running until I reached a 24-hour diner several blocks away. With shaking hands, I called the police. But as I waited for them to arrive, a chilling thought occurred to me. Would anyone believe my story? And even if they did, would we be able to save the others before the doll vans made them disappear? I knew one thing for certain. This nightmare was far from over. It's been 3 weeks since I escaped from the doll van house. 3 weeks of police interviews, nightmares, and constantly looking over my shoulder. I'm writing this now because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened. What's still happening? When the police arrived at the diner that night, I was a mess, bruised, disheveled, and babbling about hidden rooms and kidnapped babysitters. I could see the doubt in their eyes, but they took my statement and promised to investigate. They went to the house, of course, but by then, it was too late. The doll vans were gone. The basement room was empty, scrubbed clean. There was no evidence of Robert, no sign of the other girls, nothing to corroborate my story. I insisted they check missing persons reports, look into the history of the house. They did, but it led nowhere, and it was like the doll vans had never existed. The police started to question my story. Was I on drugs? Did I have a whole history of mental illness? Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, the terror in those girls' eyes, the sadness in Robert's. It was real, all of it. I've spent every waking moment since then trying to find proof. I've scoured social media, online forums, local news archives. I've reached out to every babysitting agency in the area, trying to find others who might have encountered the doll vans. Yesterday, I finally found something. A post on an obscure missing persons forum, dated 3 years ago. It was from a woman looking for her daughter, who had disappeared after taking a babysitting job. The details were vague, but one thing stood out. The family's name, Doll Van. It's not much, but it's a start. Proof that I'm not crazy, that somewhere out there, the doll vans are still operating, still trapping young women in their twisted family. I don't know what to do next. The police won't listen to me anymore. I'm afraid to go to the media. What if the doll vans see it and disappear again? But I can't just do nothing. So I'm posting this here, hoping someone will believe me, hoping someone might have information that could help, and most of all, hoping to warn others. If you see a job posting for a babysitter needed for an 18-year-old, don't take it. If you meet a family named Doll Van, run. And if you're a young woman considering a babysitting job, please be careful. Be so careful. Because somewhere out there, the doll vans are watching, waiting for their next victim, their next Mrs. Doll Van. And I'm the only one who knows the truth.